We make a lot of choices in life. Some choices are relatively simple. Like this morning, maybe you had to decide what you would have for breakfast. And I don't know what the statistics are, but half of you probably said nothing, which is fine. I've been there. Other decisions we have to make are like, what am I going to watch on TV today? Simple things like that, which may not seem simple because I know some people who just can never make up their mind about anything. And so you might say, well, deciding what to have for breakfast was actually a big show this morning in my household. But what I mean by simple decision is that your life isn't going to be permanently changed based off of what you had this morning. But we know that there are some choices that we are confronted with in this life that do have those ramifications, where you go one side and your life is going to be that way, or you go the other side and your life is going to go that way. This morning, we're going to be confronted with one of those more difficult choices. And on the surface, it's going to seem like an obvious choice. When you hear what the choice is, you're automatically going to probably go to one of them. And I'm sure that when you hear it, you're going to wonder, well, what do you mean by difficult choice? But just think about it. I don't want anyone to answer their choice out loud this morning. I don't even really want you to answer it in your head yet. I want you to take this decision that I'm going to present to you, this choice, and carry it with you this week. And instead of answering it with your words or in your mind, I want you to answer it with how your life is lived. And the choice is not something very difficult to comprehend, but it's just this. Do you want Jesus or do you want Barabbas? And like I said right away, my guess is a lot of you are like, okay, I got that answered down. I mean, we're in church, right? Made my decision already. But just think on it. Just hold it for a moment as we make our way through this passage, as we talk about it, as we shine some light on it. I want you to think about it, because if you do, you're going to find out that this choice is a lot heavier than it seems at first. So let's go ahead and read this passage. We're just going down to verse 20 for right now. And so let's pick it up at verse 1 of Mark 15. It says, very early in the morning, the chief priests and the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plan. So they bound Jesus and led him away and handed him over to Pilate. Are you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate. You have said so, Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of. But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for him what he usually did. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. What shall I do then with the one you call king of the Jews? Pilate asked them. Crucify him, they shouted. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate, but they shouted all the louder, crucify him. Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged, and then he handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together a whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, Hail, King of the Jews! Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and they spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put on his own clothes. They led him out to crucify him. So at the beginning here, Jesus finished up the night before with the Sanhedrin. And so they bring him before Pilate. And Pilate didn't live in Jerusalem, but he was typically there for the festivals because Jerusalem's population just grew exponentially during festivals. A lot of people traveling there, especially during this time of the year. And so he was there to keep a closer eye on things. And so in Pilate's presence, Jesus is asked the same two questions that he was asked in our passage from last week, right? Are you the king of the Jews? And why are you not answering? Aren't you going to speak up for yourself against these accusations? And on that first question, Jesus responds briefly, especially compared to last week, to the question, just basically saying, so you say. Right? He puts it back on Pilate. You said it, is basically all that he said. And the chief priests begin throwing accusations at him. And we find out from the other Gospels there were three offenses. I just did two, but three offenses that they brought forward. Because here's the thing. If you remember last week, the big thing that they brought up against Jesus, the reason they called for his death is because he blasphemed, at least in their eyes. Right? Blasphemy was the charge that deserved death. Well, the Romans didn't care anything about blasphemy, right? They could blaspheme God all they wanted. It didn't matter to them. It wasn't deserving of death. So the Sanhedrin had to come up with a different idea, right? We have to go about this a different way. So they drum up three accusations against him. One, he's subverting the nation, meaning he's trying to create an uprising. He's trying to bring people onto his side to fight against Rome. Number two, that he opposes paying taxes to Caesar. And number three, that he claims to be the Messiah, a king. Now, those first two accusations are absolutely false, right? We saw in the garden when Jesus was being arrested that Peter tried to start an uprising, and Jesus put a stop to it immediately, and he healed Malchus's ear, if you remember that. And then the second one was obviously false, and the Pharisees knew this because they were the ones that asked him about this. A month or so ago, we looked at that, where they came up and they asked Jesus, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And they had the Herodians there, remember that? And Jesus said, give to Caesar what's Caesar's, right? So he doesn't oppose paying taxes to Caesar. It's just a flat lie. The third thing holds a little bit of credence, but it's wildly misrepresented. Jesus did finally publicly take on that title of the Messiah, right, which is a king, but as Jesus explained to Pilate in John 18, Jesus' kingdom is not of this world, right? It wasn't going to interfere, it wasn't intersecting with Pilate's kingdom or Caesar's. He wasn't going to be overthrowing Caesar's kingdom. And so the Sanhedrin had to come up with these charges because the Romans notoriously had no patience for rebels. I mean, they would just squash out rebellions as quickly as they could. And that was one of the reasons they had crucifixion in the first place, was because they wanted something so horrendous that no one would even think twice about trying to uprise against Rome. And so they bring Jesus to Pilate thinking, hey, if we throw out the idea that he's trying to create an uprising, Pilate will just go with it. But what they didn't count on is Pilate seeing Jesus for who he really was. At least seeing that Jesus was different from every other person who had been brought before him as an upriser. Right? Jesus was not loud and boisterous and calling down condemnation on Rome. He wasn't trying to bring other people with him. He was just standing there silently taking it all in. And Pilate could see that Jesus was different. He was amazed just at the presence of Jesus. He knew that he was innocent. And so he tried over and over again to try and get Jesus released. And it didn't work because he didn't do the one thing that would have actually gotten Jesus off the hook. Pilate had full power from Caesar himself over life and death in this type of situation. He could have just said, guys, let him go. He's innocent. He doesn't deserve this. He is free to go. But the Jews in the Sanhedrin started calling out and saying, hey, if you do that, we're going to tell Caesar that you don't care about Rome. We're going to tell Caesar that you are against them. And Pilate just was not the type of guy to handle that type of stress well. I think some people try to understand Pilate a little too much to the point where we sit there and we think, oh yeah, Pilate, he had no other choice here. But really, history does not paint a very pretty picture of Pilate for us. Mark Moore summarizes the life of Pilate, his documented life, like this. He was a self-seeking political opportunist who disdained the Jews. Right? In other words, he was a guy who only cared about his own political career, and that was it. Right? Unlike anyone in our political sphere today. But on top of that, the Jews were constantly a thorn in his side. When Pilate first took over this position, one of the things that he did was hang up a whole bunch of shields in the corridor of the temple, or in the compound of the temple that had the emperor's picture on it. And he thought, hey, if I do this, the emperor's going to see it, and he's going to take this as a grand gesture, right? Because he was trying to further his political career. Well, the Jews, rightfully so, were appalled by this. This is the house of God. Why do we have Caesar all over this. So they went to Pilate, a couple hundred of them, I think, just over 100. And they said, you need to take this all down. And unlike in our story today, Pilate didn't buckle. He said, no, I'm not taking it down. In fact, you all need to leave before I kill every last one of you. So the Jews did something slightly unexpected. They all laid down on the ground, exposed their necks, and said, okay. And Pilate was like, if I kill all of them, my political life is over, and probably my life. So he gave in, and he took down the shield. So needless to say, this crowd of people was not Pilate's first rodeo with the Jewish nation. However, this time, Pilate makes an even more fatal error in his judgment. He believed he could make everyone happy. He thought that he could appease this huge crowd, save Jesus' life and his own conscience at the same time. And as he discovered, like so many of us have, when we chase down win-win situations, we end up with a lose-lose situation. And Pilate ended up not appeasing anyone. And the most glaring example of this is actually seen in Luke's gospel. And Luke gives us a little more details about what happens here, that when Jesus is first brought to Pilate, it comes out that he's from Galilee. And so Pilate thinks, oh, great, that's not my jurisdiction. That's Herod's jurisdiction. Take him to Herod. Let Herod deal with this. So he goes over to Herod and is almost immediately brought back because Herod said, dude, he's innocent. He didn't say dude, but he said he's innocent. I don't find any fault with him. And so Pilate is now stressed again because now the problem is back on him. And so in Luke 23, this is how he handles that situation to try and appease everyone. It says, Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and he said to them, you brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence, and I have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, look at this. Therefore, I will punish him and release him. A couple verses later, they kept shouting, crucify him, crucify him. For the third time, Pilate spoke to them. Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore, I will punish him and release him. Pilate thought he could win here by saying, I'm going to go punish Jesus. I'll make the crowd happy. I'll save Jesus' life. Everyone wins. And it didn't work. And this punishment that he sends Jesus off to was not like going to an air-conditioned jail cell on the weekends for a couple of months or something like that. This was brutal. And he sends an innocent man there knowingly. He said twice, I find him completely innocent. He hasn't done anything wrong, so I'm going to punish him, and then I'll release him. And this punishment is called flogging, and it just says there in verse 15 that he was taken off to be flogged. 60% of people who endured flogging died because of it. And it was a really common thing to do for someone who was about to be crucified. I mean, it just made it that much worse, right? Open wounds on the back, and then you're having to carry the crossbeam all the way to the hill. But they used, when they did flogging, they didn't hold back. The Romans didn't hold back. Jews had a certain level, right? They had a spot where they would draw the line. Romans didn't have that. They made a sport out of it. They would use this thing called a cat of nine tails, which was like a piece of wood with 9 pieces of leather coming off of it. But they wouldn't whip people in the traditional sense, like maybe you've seen before in movies or TV shows. They would tie in broken pieces of bone, sharp bone, and glass and metal and little metal balls. And so that way when they would whip them, it wasn't to make them sting, it was to grab hold. And then they would drag it on the back. Their goal was to rip up as much as possible from their victim. And most of those that died because a lot of times the whip would go around the front. And it would just tear everything up. I remember when I read about this as a kid, I just wondered, how in the world is flogging reduced to just verse 15? I mean, in every gospel, it just says he was taken off and flogged. You know, how is not more of that described? And I think the reason being that they knew what that meant. They didn't need descriptions of it. They knew that Jesus would have been led away, his arms put above his head so that his muscles are nice and taut. and he would have been whipped to within an inch of his life. But it didn't stop there, because after he was flogged, Jesus has walked into the praetorium where about 600 Roman soldiers would have come in to mock him. They dressed him in a purple robe. And I don't know if you've ever dealt with open wounds and cloth before, but it's not a great combination. I remember in high school, I really messed up the bottom of my foot. And so rather than going to a doctor like a normal person, I was a teenager and knew proper medical treatment in this situation. So I put just a piece of gauze on it. And that was a terrible, terrible mistake, because as you know, when wounds heal, they just bind to whatever is around them. That's why Band-Aids have that little, very clear plastic on them, so it doesn't hold on to the wound. So anyway, the next morning I went to change it and experienced quite a bit of pain, and needless to say, made it a whole lot worse. Well, right after Jesus is flogged and his back is torn up to pieces, one of the first things they do is put this robe on him. He's going to cling to the open, bloody wounds. They put that crown of thorns on him, which from a pain scale wouldn't have meant that much, right? You don't have that many nerve endings in your head, but it would have been a bloody mess just pouring down on him. They would have had him sit there, stand there, kneel there as they hurled these false ideas, these in their minds funny things at him. Oh, hail the King of the Jews. Look at this guy. Beating him over the head with a staff, spitting on his face. I mean, they made a sport of it. I don't know for sure. I can't say for sure, but it's possible they were taking out a lot of frustration on Jesus, as if he were a scapegoat. I've mentioned before how much the Jews hated Rome, but the feeling was quite mutual. They hated the Jews just as much. They were also a thorn in their side. They were so frustrated by them and annoyed by them. Now imagine if someone came before you as a representative of everything that angers you about your job or your life, or everything that makes everything difficult for you is now there. You have free will to do whatever you want to them. After they have their fun, Jesus is walked out before the crowd again, disfigured. Isaiah 53 describes the fact that he didn't look like a man anymore. He was so disfigured. And Pilate calls one last time. Says, look, all right, I've done this. It's enough. Let's end this. And they call out even louder, crucify him. Crucify him. So finally, Pilate does the thing. He brings out the water and he washes his hands. And he says, all right, I'm free of this, but you guys do what you want to do. And he forces Jesus. And they actually take him back and they rip that robe off, put his clothes back on, and make him carry the cross out to Calvary or Golgotha. Now, just to clarify, Pilate washing his hands symbolized nothing more than his gutlessness, right? Just because if someone killed someone really close to you, but then they washed their hands in the process of it, would that make a difference to you? It made no difference. It was symbolic of nothing than the fact that he didn't stand up and do the right thing in this situation. Jesus' blood was still on his hands. It's still something he participated in. No amount of water was going to undo that. And yet, as I read about Pilate, we kind of see ourselves. I think we're more active participants in the death of Jesus than we care to admit. We don't want to acknowledge that my sin demanded that this take place. We don't want to acknowledge all those times that I just do what I want to do and I ignore what God has called me to do, that this is what had to happen so that God, who loves us, could be united with us. We have to have that dissonance, that separation between the act, because when we think about it, it just hurts. Or we don't want to believe that we're capable of something like this. We have a tendency in the States here to say and proclaim that, if it came to it, I would die for Jesus. I would die for my faith, which is wonderful and noble. But the real question you need to answer isn't whether you're willing to die, but do you actually trust him with your life? I mean, really trust him. When life doesn't go like how you planned it to go, how do you react? Do you actually trust Jesus? What if everything that you set your mind to just fails, falls apart before your eyes? Do you trust God in that situation? What if people disown you, drag you down, beat you up, stop believing in you, or make life just difficult every single day? Do you trust God through those circumstances? I've been made aware of a trend in American preaching lately that has been observed by people more observant than myself. And it's subtle, but it's very dangerous. Basically, sermons will come forth that if you heard them, you would think that there's nothing wrong with them. But they focus only on God, how God empowers us, how God loves us and moves us and strengthens us and accomplishes great world-changing things. And that's all you ever hear about, are the awesome power of God, how big it is. And we don't picture what David Garland describes as the passive suffering of a seemingly powerless Savior who submits to beatings and mockery. God's power isn't just about dividing seas. It's about being able to stand there and take it when everything is pouring down on you, quite literally, the entire sin of mankind throughout history. We want Barabbas. We wouldn't say that, especially not right now, but we think it. Barabbas was probably loved by this crowd. I mean, he helped do what a lot of people wanted Jesus to do, right? He participated in an uprising. He killed someone in this uprising. That's what they wanted, right? We want to take just some of that power that we saw in Jesus, the power to calm a storm with his words. Just bring a little bit of that, Jesus, and wipe Rome out, drive them out, conquer our enemies. We want our enemies to be vanquished, squashed, and beat down, destroyed. We want to see the mighty fire of God come down and just rain on our enemies and swallow them whole. We know he can do it. So Lord, come down, just do it. Wipe everyone out that's standing against you. We want Barabbas. We want an upriser. We want someone of action who will fight to the death for our cause, our beliefs, our views, our wants, our lives. Give us Barabbas. We don't trust God. We don't trust that when Jesus told us to love your enemies and pray for those that persecute you, that he really meant it. That it's more than just one of those phrases we put up on the wall in our homes and look at it. It makes us feel good because it's different from this world. We don't trust that he knows what he's doing. And sure, we trust in the promise that after this life we get him for eternity. We would die for him. But what if things actually get bad? David Garland continues saying, we may trust God to take care of the afterlife, but we don't trust God enough to let go of too much control of the here and now. If we have to suffer, we would rather put our trust in the Barabbases of this world who fight back and murder enemies. We have yet to see that this way only leads to more death and tragedy. Give us Barabbas. We don't understand, or we just flat out reject the mindset Paul had of, Lord, let me decrease that you might increase. Really what we want is, Lord, let me increase. And if you can increase too, great. Win-win. We've made this life so much about ourselves that we ignore what Jesus so passionately taught and lived, that this isn't about you. It's not for you. The simple story of life is that there is a hell that people are heading towards. But God loves us so much that he miraculously put together this plan so that people who reject him might have a way. People who have turned their lives against him might have a way to cling to him. That Son would somehow, in a way we can't ever understand, become flesh and live among his imperfect creation who destroyed what he pictured for us for over 30 years, only to be betrayed, beaten, and killed by them without so much as raising his voice. What do you actually want? Jesus or Barabbas? Does your life reflect your decision? Just listen to these words of Jesus. Just hear what he said in Luke 6. But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, don't demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect full repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners expecting to be repaid in full. But you love your enemies. Do good to them and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you'll be children of the Most High, because He is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. You want Jesus or Barabbas? These weren't just words to Jesus. He didn't just throw out something that sounded good. He put to words what he was living for us in that moment. I mean, he spent 3 years with those 12 apostles, knowing one of them would betray him, all of them would leave and flee, and it would take him years to fully get everything he was trying to teach them. He was merciful to the ungrateful and the wicked. And he gives us that call. He doesn't say be merciful to the people who will be merciful to you. It's striking that he says to lend to your enemies without expecting anything in return. That's just a small picture of it. Do you want Jesus or Barabbas? We're going to sing a few songs as we close. And I encourage you to pray this morning. I mean, just maybe your prayer is, God, show me this type of humility that I'm missing out on right now, that I don't understand, I don't get it. Or maybe your prayer is, God, show me this love, this mercy. I mean, it's called the fruit of the Spirit for a reason. It's because it's outside of your abilities. It's the Spirit producing it in you. Maybe that's your prayer this morning. God, produce this in me. If we all lived like this, maybe the whole world won't change, but for a moment the world would see our Jesus through us. As we sing these last 3 songs, remember that this story didn't end here. Jesus persevered through even more pain and suffering and shame, but it brought eternal hope to you and me. That by His wounds we are healed, not just from our sin, but in our relationship with God. And when we take communion, if you've accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior, you can come forward, take that bread, remember His body that was ripped up for you. Remember His blood with the juice and the promise that His blood brings us, that we have an eternal hope in Him. It's not from you, but He invites you to be a part of it. Remember His body and His blood. Make Him your Lord. Make Him your choice. And love like Jesus in this world. If you're able, please stand and let's praise God now.